And welcome to another edition of Leadership Live. We are live streaming on LinkedIn, Facebook, and of course on Zoom. Thank you for signing up. Thank you for attending. For those of you that have never seen a Leadership Live, the whole idea behind what we do is really tackling topics that leaders are contending with, that people are contending with, and bringing some experts on, or at least some folks with some opinions, to talk about these specific items. My name's Steve Lois. I'm actually your host. Now, the one thing I'm going to caution everybody on is since we're streaming on so many different platforms, we can't monitor all the comments on all of your platforms. So if you're watching this, if you have a comment or a question, please text my cell, which is right here, 734-837-8500. Again, 734-837-8500. Now, today's topic is an interesting topic that the four of us, and I'll introduce my three co-guests here in just a second, or three co-presenters, whatever you want to call them. But this topic of accountability is probably one of the more struggling topics that we've had conversations about, where leaders continually bring up, how do I hold my team accountable? Then on the flip side, it's individuals saying, well, this accountability thing doesn't make sense to me because it doesn't feel good. It's like micromanagement and so on. So we're going to tackle a lot of the questions that you as the audience have already sent me or to Leah or others, as well as comments. So I would encourage you to play an active role. But with that, I want to introduce my three friends here, and I'm going to read some of their bio just so we're all aware. I know all three of them to certain levels, but just so we're all on the same page. Felisa to my right, and I got your name right after all this time, which I continually screw up. But VP of Global People and Culture for Dawn Foods. If you don't know Dawn Foods, a global leader in bakery product, ingredient manufacturing, and distribution across the globe, correct? You lead the organization's global people and culture strategy, focusing on talent development, performance management, succession planning, talent acquisition, and a bunch of stuff, right? So you were also honored here recently, Crane's Detroit class under 40, 22 class under 40. Congratulations, by the way, on that. Here's some interesting stuff. Bachelor of Arts from the State University of New York, Master of Science in Clinical Psychology from Loyola, and a Master of Human Resources and Labor Relations from Michigan State.
Go green.
Where's the PhD?
Just been a little busy.
All right. Fair enough. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having
Kathy,
me.
my newest friend.
Yes.
We haven't spent a whole lot of time with each other, but Managing Director and Michigan Market Leader for Aon, and more than 16 years at this point with Aon. But you've got a lot of community development and other things that you spend a lot of your time in, even beyond running the markets that you actually run. Detroit Economic Club, Girl Scouts of Southeastern Michigan, American Corporate Partners for Veterans. I mean, you are busy outside of work.
It's just one of those things I feel firmly in giving back, and I think it helps develop me and really understand what's going on in the broader world.
I love this comment. I don't know who gave me this, but Kathy's drive to foster growth in others underscores her belief in the power of commitment and collaboration to enact positive change. And I would say, based on our little bit of interaction over the last couple of months, that seems to fit you pretty well.
Perfect. Well, thanks.
So
Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to make sure I got it right. And then my friend RJ over here, another cigar smoker. But RJ was most recently the CEO for Unify Finance, which was a division, or is a division, of the Bank of Ann Arbor. 10 years there, grew the business from 10 to more than $115 million. I didn't know you were a veteran. So thank you for your service. 3 years in the Air Force, and a consummate entrepreneur from the time you got out of the Air Force, is what I understand, where you guys started this
Scribe-A-Town Inn.
Scribe-A-Town Inn, which was an outdoor venue, a motel, and other stuff.
My dad had to be crazy. He was our bankroll at 23. I was the age of 23, and he financed the whole acquisition for us. Rest his soul. I don't know why he did it, but I got my MBA in how to run a business at a young age.
Well, which is great. And the other thing that I appreciated about your website is moved into the corporate world by mistake.
It was by mistake.
Maybe at some point I'll ask you online here, but three senior folks that I think will be great on this idea of accountability. So let's jump in, if you guys are good with this. And again, if you have questions, 734-837-8500. So why is the topic of accountability in your minds, or is it in your minds, such a big issue right now?
Go ahead.
Sure. I think it's when you think of accountability, people automatically, or maybe many people automatically feel like, oh, I'm being punished, or if I don't do this thing, I don't achieve this thing, hit this goal, hit these numbers, something terrible is going to happen to me. And I think that comes from, if you think about as you're a kid, if you do something wrong or you make a mistake, you might feel a negative consequence. And so people associate accountability with negativity. And when we think about this in terms of the workplace, obviously everyone has goals, objectives. We have, from an organization level to an individual level, we have things we need to do and things we need to achieve. And when those things don't happen, how we respond or what happens to us, if it's the negative feeling thing, it's not done in the right way, people may internalize that and feel that, and then it's like, I don't want to be accountable. I don't want to do it, because if I don't, something bad's going to happen to me.
Afraid to be accountable.
And I would agree with that, because that's a personal choice if you want to be held accountable or not. It comes down to the person, I believe, from my philosophy. If I want to be held accountable, then I take action to make sure that my responsibilities are taken care of. It doesn't matter what's in front of me. And a good illustration of that is, say, Steve, I hired you to clean this room. Okay, that's the responsibility I gave you, to clean the room, but I gave you 3 specific things. Make sure the chairs are aligned, the floor is swept, and the tables are straightened. Well, one day I come in and the floor's not swept. And I say, that's your responsibility. I say, Steve, what happened to the floor? Why isn't it swept? You said, well, I blew a fuse and I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And you said, there's nowhere in my job description that says I should have to change a fuse. However, the person that owns accountability, and that's an entrepreneur in my mind, will figure out a way how to get that floor swept, cleaned up, no matter what. Either they're going to fix the fuse, they're going to find a broom, they're going to find an alternative broom or something, electric vacuum, to get it done. That's the difference from my perspective.
So you got 2 different views, and Kathy, I want your opinion on this, or thoughts on this, because yours is kind of the personal, starting with the personal accountability. I think where you were going was a little bit of both, but most of the questions I got was kind of from, I think, more from the employee perspective, I think, because I don't know who all the folks are, but it seemed to be more from my boss. I don't like the way my boss, quote unquote, holds me accountable. And then from some of the ones that I got from the boss's perspective, because I want to bring these 2 together here in a second, was I'm afraid to hold my team accountable.
Yeah.
Especially with what's going on now. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I would say, if you back up, right, like, why has accountability risen to such a level? It seems to be the corporate buzzword, right? They kind of run around. Funny enough, I was supposed to be in Chicago again today for some corporate training with an external trainer, and it was on accountability, and I started laughing. I was like, okay, well, this is really interesting, because I'm talking about accountability.
So you were accountable to coming here.
I
so
was. I did choose here versus showing up for that.
Personal choice. I do like
that. But I'm super interested to hear from everyone else, back to the accountability piece. I can't be there, but following up to say, what'd you guys take away from that session will be really good. But when I think about, like, what's accountability, when we step back, if you look at the number of changes globally, even just most recently here in our local market for the UAW strikes, we continue to have such a tumultuous level of change. And I think business leaders are trying to keep pace with, how do we still deliver results which allow us to serve our clients, serve our colleagues, reinvest in them, and if you're publicly traded, serve our shareholders, right? And ultimately it comes to accountability. But to your point on, is it a bad word? Not in my opinion. I think clarity, like, is kind, right? Being clear is kind. Having the ability to very clearly just lay out expectations is a key to a really strong relationship, and even key to hiring the right people to make sure you're making good investments. And if it's done well, then there shouldn't be a contentiousness between the employee and the manager or the employer. But there's a lot of change happening. So
I agree with that. Go ahead.
No, I agree with that too. I think when you have a leader who maybe doesn't have the capability to have those kind of kind, clear conversations, that's where accountability as an employee or a team member, you feel like you don't like how you're being held accountable because it's not clear, or
something's happening to you instead of happening with you. When it comes to I have to clean the room, okay, the table, the floors, and I forgot the third thing you said.
The chair, just make sure the tables are
And
straight.
straighten the table. But are you, as the leader, going to tell me exactly how I have to do or everything, or can I, as the employee? Okay, well, here's how I think I can get that done.
Right.
And then it's done.
And
it happened with me, not to me.
And I would love to expand on that. So when we would hire people at Unify, I would always make the direct comment to the candidate that if the job description that we're hiring you today is the same a year from now, we haven't done our job and you haven't done your job in terms of the opportunity to, because you're in the trenches every day. You're going to see where areas to improve. As we talked about a little bit earlier before we came on, sometimes we're so close to the business we have blind spots.
For sure.
We want to foster an environment to have that feedback back to us.
Can we go back though to something that Felicia, you said originally, is that as your kid, when you do something that you're not supposed to do, your parents hold you accountable and so on. Isn't there a little bit of ingraining that we're doing for those of us that have kids, we were all kids at one point? So we grow up with this. Is this possible? That part of this is we grow up with that idea that, oh crap, I did something wrong. I didn't straighten the table the way I was supposed to at home, and my dad's going to come in and he's going to whoop my butt, right? That's his version of accountability, because that was my dad's version of accountability. Mm-hmm. Does that really play into some of what's going on now? So, because I think there's an employer perspective and an employee perspective. Would you agree with that, or would you not agree with that?
Well, as Kathy said earlier, as long as the leader is communicated properly, where the individual understands their responsibilities and the actual actions that they need to take to perform the duty, then it should be fairly clear. And I agree with you. Accountable typically is when someone says you're being held accountable and it's a bad situation.
Right.
No one ever comes up to you and say, "Hey, great job this month. You hit all your responsibilities. You're so accountable." We don't use it in that context.
I think there's the gap when you say like no one does. And I will tell you, my growth as a leader continues to evolve. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I was coached on very early, it's a lot easier to have tough conversations when you also have kind reinforcing conversations. Sure. Mm-hmm. To say, you did that well, keep doing it. The impact of doing that was, or like, I'm super proud of the outcome. And so when you're reinforcing the positive behavior, kindly saying, hey, I noticed you did this. Here was the impact. In the future, I would suggest you maybe pivot it, and here would be the beneficial outcome. It doesn't feel so harsh, like you're just not, why didn't you do your job? Like, that's not a helpful conversation, right? So there's so much learning and coaching, and if you think the number of people we have in leadership positions has changed drastically, are they getting the support and the coaching they need externally, internally? Because a lot of times people just put leaders in without good training.
Well, as well as they have more responsibilities in today's world as a leader. Think about 10 years ago, a person in your role, my role, or Steve's role, you didn't have all the responsibilities and being held accountable for so many different things. I think it's challenging for leaders, especially when they're put into that position as a first-time leader, to slow down because they're just focused on success. I'm guilty of that. When I became CEO, the only thing I wanted to do was make sure that we were successful. Because I moved my family to Michigan. I was going to do everything in my power, and you lose the human element of it. And I burned bridges during that time. I clearly own that. Steve and I have talked about this at length. Yeah. And I owned it, and I'm continuing trying to get better. But it's hard for new leaders because especially if it's their first opportunity, they don't want to let people down, but they're burning relationships over that. Would you?
I would argue that it's not just new leaders. I think leaders at all levels, true. Because it's how you were treated, what you saw modeled for you. But I think, Kathy, to your point, how I sort of kind of characterize what you said, it's accountability with empathy. Like the two you can have both at the same time. You can hold people accountable, have the conversations on the expectations, but do it in the right way. And that's something I think leaders at all levels can work on. I mean, for myself included, I feel that.
I agree with that. You said something that was interesting that I think is very true. Accountability is often a look back. It's the deadline has occurred, and now we're going to look back on that. But what about all the time in between when you started and the deadline? Like, where do we, or how do we, and this is one of the questions that we got asked that I'll paraphrase it, right? It's always, the negativity often comes out, not just because we were trained like that when we were younger, but we get into the work environment, we're given a deadline, which is nothing wrong with the deadline, But the accountability comes and it becomes a bad thing when it's just a look back. You didn't achieve it, so now what? How do you bring accountability into the timeline in between start and deadline?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think it's conversations. You need to have a cadence of conversations, check-ins. Ideally, right, it should be a two-way street. The people leader can be checking in with their team. The team members should feel comfortable and have every right to talk to their leaders and or their leaders, right, and within the organization and other people about what's happening. And I've been a firm believer, you shouldn't end up at the end of a project or a mid-year review or at your review and be surprised about anything that is being said on that document, because you're having consistent conversations. And it's about how can we help you improve? Is there good alignment? Everything you did really well. But I think it takes time. It takes a lot of time. Time that you have to be willing to carve out and put forth if you want to have the best team and you want to have the best possible results. And it's hard, right? There are days where you're just like, okay, I can do this, right? Like you're like, I've
cheering
got
yourself
this,
up in the morning.
Like, I may have landed at 11 o'clock last night and had practically no sleep because I had to be somewhere at 7:30 this morning for another, like, I got to do this, but it's energizing. And then,
do you think the culture plays into that as well in terms of peer accountability?
I think it is ultimately the underpinning of everything, the culture. If you don't feel good about the culture you're in, there's toxicity. It's tough. I mean, I was mentioning, I think before we even got started, I was at a training and decided to be here. Today it was part 2. And this external coach gave a really great example. And it's really easy to get stuck in what's wrong and bad. Sure. And she drew a circle, like, and she's like, here's all the issues. And then like, here's what you can control. So figure out what you can control. And gave a great story behind it, right? Like her example was being stuck in Seattle. And she hated the rain. It rained for 35 days. And she's like, what did I just do to myself?
This sucks.
And she goes, I kept showing up. And finally the person like I was reporting to pulled me aside, like, really worried. Like every conversation is about rain. Like all you do is talk about rain. She's like, and I finally realized I just have to buy a new coat and I have to buy new boots and I have to get a new hairstyle and I have to get new clothes. And then it all changed for her, but because her perspective on it changed versus this is the worst decision I ever made. So what is it? The saying is, you can keep it, you can change it, or you can leave it.
Yeah.
Right? You got to make a decision where you want to be in that.
I was just going to say the culture piece, I think, is key because, again, if you have individual leaders who see accountability differently, act with their teams about accountability, but from an organizational level, what's driving that, right? At the end of the day, everyone's accountable to something for themselves, their teams, the organization. And if, your top leadership is promoting a culture of accountability where it's not just happening to you, and this is exactly what you said, Kathy, it's happening with you. So here's this project, here's this timeline. How can you get it done? What do you need? Check with me. Let's check,
don't wait till the 11th hour.
To the end. But if you have a broader culture that only cares, hey, you did this or you didn't, and it doesn't matter why or what. If it's only about the what and not the how you got there,
or even the
why, the relationships, it makes it negative.
So before we go further than it, here's what I'd like each of the three of you to do. If you had to define, in your own words, accountability, just a simple 1-sentence, 2-sentence definition.
Obligation to act.
Obligation to act.
I think it's delivering on your commitments.
Okay.
Following through on your word.
Okay. I don't think any of those are inappropriate. So let's, if it's that simple, let's kind of go back to the original question, right? Why are so many leaders struggling with this? And if it's about filling the gap in the timeline, you said empathy and results. You got to kind of have the two together.
Empathy and accountability.
And accountability. Let me give you a quick example, then I want to go back to that original question. So when I was younger, my parents taught, my dad in particular, old country, he came from Poland. So he was proud when he got his second house in the suburbs, right? This was a big deal. You know those people that cut the grass on an angle and then they come back and cut it on the angle the other way, so you've got this checkerboard? That was my dad, because he was really proud of it. And eventually he taught me how to cut the grass specifically. So he was going to hold me accountable to the way I cut that grass. And I did a pretty good job of it. Ended up picking up the neighborhood, picking up all kinds of lawns to be able to cut. In particular, one guy next door, his name was Mr. Pete. Mr. Pete was in like his 70s or 80s, and he had a special needs child that was in his 50s. And his wife, while she was alive, did the same thing. Cut the grass perfectly. It looked better than my dad's grass, even when I was cutting it, right? Eventually, she passed away. So he had asked me to cut the grass, and I kind of approached him to do it. But I was 14 years old. So at some point, I was going to cut corners. I want to play with my buddies. In fact, we were playing football across the street. I hadn't done the things he had asked me to do. But Mr. Pete was a wise old man. And he would walk his dog, Rusty, down the street a couple times a day. And he saw we were playing football on the other side. And he walks by and he says, Steve, come over here. I said, hey, Mr. Pete, how you doing? He says, great. He says, how do you think my lawn looks from across the street? And I'm like, oh, crap. And I started bawling right away. It's like I knew what he was doing. But he's like, hey, what do you think we could do better? Can I help you actually do this? That was, to me, accountability with empathy, where he was teaching me and was willing to help me to actually get there. Kind of what you were saying, right, is that we've got to have this balance during the timeline. So if it's truly that easy and it's truly the definitions you guys gave, why are so many leaders struggling with this? Not just the employee, because we talked about it from the employee side. Why do we really struggle with making accountability a positive thing and not just negative?
Well, I'll give you a counterpoint to the lawn story.
Yeah.
I had this similar issue, except I was Mr. Pete.
You were.
And hired the neighbor kid, and I did not handle it like Mr. Pete did. I was like, he is not. I just said within these 3 days, I gave him flexibility. He's not edging. I was like off my rocker. I was so mad that he didn't do it. I was like, not my best day.
Yeah,
so I learned from it, right? You learn from things. So I think that's the big question, is learning from it. When you step back and I ask new people leaders, like, why is this uncomfortable? We're having an issue with one of the colleagues, and they're just so uncomfortable. They don't know how to have the conversations, is what I generally find. I know it's a problem, but it's usually why can't they just do it? And I'm like, okay, so we have to help. Like, let me help you, give you some suggestions on how to have the conversation so we get to a place. Because ultimately, we want them to succeed, right, within our environment. We don't want them to not work for us any longer. But I think that's what it is. They don't know what to do. How many people through the course of your career, when you didn't know what to do, when you didn't feel like you had a good network, felt a little frozen? Like, I'm just going to ostrich it and I'm going to avoid it and hope it goes away, which
it doesn't.
It doesn't.
It gets worse. It gets worse. It never goes away. It gets worse.
Yeah, it does.
So
it always gets worse.
I think that's the issue, but I welcome what your thoughts are.
What if we just change the word from accountability to scorecard? It's a different conversation because you're really measuring the same thing. If they achieve the objectives of the job description, and you reference a scorecard versus accountability, because again, there's a connotation of negativity to the word because we grew up. I love what you said earlier. We grew up as our parents saying, I'm holding you, you're punished and you're accountable for your actions. It's a consequence.
Accountability and consequence are often found together. It can
be, but I don't think as leaders we do that though. Use it in that context. Again,
I think you can call it a scorecard, you can call it accountability, you can call it whatever you want. I think it's the what you're doing and the how you're doing it. And Kathy, to your point, you can have the conversations. No one's saying don't hold anyone accountable. We all have to be accountable for something.
For sure.
And I think sometimes as leaders and just your own sort of personality and you said, how did he not know this was wrong? If you're someone who high accountability for yourself, and we're not putting ourselves in other people's shoes.
Yeah,
and I think that's what we need to do. Okay, so this didn't get done. Before I sort of, go on a rant and maybe bring someone down, let me stop and think and ask questions. Well, why didn't this happen? What can we do differently? Like be Mr. Pete.
Yeah.
And then use motivation to help drive accountability versus you must get this done or the world's going to end and you will have no food. I mean, that's not helpful.
That's
for most people. Everyone's different, but for most people.
That's true. I mean, everybody is a little bit different, but I think we all need some of that. Again, in between that start and that end point, all of us need some level motivation, inspiration, support, empathy, whatever term that you actually want in there. But we're kind of missing the gap. Many of us as leaders are missing the gap and going right to the end again, for sure. So here was one of the other questions that's related to this. What's the difference between responsibility, accountability, and ownership? Is there a difference between responsibility?
I believe so. Responsibility is the obligation to understand what your job description is. You understand that responsibility. The accountability piece is, as I mentioned earlier, the obligation to act. What was the third one? Ownership falls into accountability. I think they're synonyms. They run together. At Unify, we actually read, great story, Extreme Ownership.
Yeah, for sure.
Great book. The whole company read it. We'd pick a book every year and read it. We stopped doing that probably 4 years ago. Well, I had this senior salesperson with the company 30 years, sweetheart of a man, incredible soul. Well, he read that book and he took it to heart. Everything he did in his life, it was life-changing for him. And he would reference extreme ownership, extreme ownership. I own it. I'm not a victim. I deliver my results. And it was fascinating. This gentleman was late 60s, maybe mid 60s. But that is ownership because it resonated with him, just like accountability. I think again, that's my beliefs. They coincide with each other.
What do you think, Lisa?
I think it depends.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you think about like a RACI model, you have responsible and accountable, and sometimes it's the same person or the same people, it's different. But when I think about responsibility, I'm responsible for doing X, Y, Z.
It's in your job description.
This is in the job description, or this is in the project. But accountable, there's ultimately someone who's accountable to ensure that those things get done. And they can get done because the accountable person does them, or the accountable person delegates them to others. So maybe your team.
Okay.
But I think in understanding accountable, responsible, and ownership, it's in the conversation of, this is the work we're doing, this project to build this table. Ultimately, I'm accountable for this table to get built, but how I go about that, I'm going to have you're going to build the legs, you're going to put the top together, you're going to screw the screws. And if one of those things doesn't get done, I need to have the conversation, hey, it's not getting done. How do we work through this? But at the end of the day, if the table doesn't get built, it's on me as the accountable person.
Yeah.
So I think it's all three at the same time, but also not. It depends on how you define it and how you're communicating it.
Is that part of the challenge, though, that we all
so.
define it differently, so there's confusion around it? Because we throw out, and I'm saying collectively, we as just business people, in general, parents, it doesn't matter. We throw out those three terms consistently. So, Kathy, what's your take on responsibility, accountability, ownership? Is there a difference?
Yeah, I think there can be difference, to Felicia's point, depending on the company and the various roles. I think that's where we run into trouble, is the clarity.
Yeah.
So if we use the table example, right? So ultimately, I say all the time, I ultimately own it in the end. If I'm calling because there was a service issue, right? I had the people that were accountable. I had the people that were responsible through the entire size of the team. But it's still, I have that responsibility to own, apologize for the mistake, make it right. We use the table. The problem is we can walk in because in my mind, it's supposed to be level. But the other person just heard, put the table together. They don't care that it's going to rock back and forth. You told me to put it together, right? Not realizing the outcome. So it's a lot of, I think, taking the extra time to clearly articulate the expectation, the why, what the impact is if it doesn't happen, because now we're going to sit here and hear this crazy, and by the way, it doesn't rock. So it's totally good. The table's great.
Quality furniture here.
Whoever built this did a good job, but you're not going to hear this bang, 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 right, as you're taping, right? So people don't necessarily understand that. It's like you just said, build the table. I built the table.
As well as post-COVID too, you don't know what's going on in that person's life too. They might have something going on that's causing stress where you weren't getting their best performance for that day. So you have to weed through that too. And that's an area that, Steve, I've worked on with you about the whole empathy piece of understanding there's more in this person's world than just Unify, or what's taking place. Now, if it's a behavior where you're seeing a trend, that's a whole different conversation. But if it's a one-time event, a lot of times that's where that empathy piece comes in.
For sure.
Can I be devil's advocate for a second?
You absolutely.
So I know this is the super simple example of the table, and that, you just said build the table. You didn't say it had to be level. And like, I guess to think about I don't know if that's accountability or that's, well, I think about quality and how people's level of, wanting to do a good job, like intrinsically, I want to make sure this is correct. To build the table and it's wobbly and be like, well, I built the table.
Yeah.
I think that's almost a different conversation.
That's that personal ownership thing.
It's
that
personal ownership, but it's personal, like caring about the product that you gave, not that you just got it done. So for me, that goes a step farther. And I think about work too. You told me, to create this PowerPoint or whatever, but it's got spelling errors, the format's off, the graphics are horrendous. Did you not see that, or help me understand why didn't, like, to me, that's not that's accountability for quality. And for some reason that feels a little bit different.
But don't you believe that you can identify the two? I call them functional and vital in companies, where that functional employee, they might just let it rock and that's fine. But that vital employee, they're going to figure out a way how to probably make it better than what you were hoping for. And it's magical when you find those team members. It's unbelievable. And those are the folks that you just pour into. Example of that at Unify, we hired a lady out of the Detroit Red Wings. She was there for 8 years. And we were able to hire her to come into Unify. She started as my executive assistant. Today, now she's the portfolio manager, collection manager. She's received all kinds of pay increases, but we saw that in her, that just ownership and accountability, but it was always above and beyond what any of us ever expected.
So that you actually just described kind of my thought process, going back to my original three: responsibility, accountability, and ownership. Responsibility is in your job description. Here's what you're responsible for. Now, could there be some items in there that are not clear? Absolutely, and it kind of screws the whole thing up, right?
Great.
Accountability is the obligation to do it. To me, ownership is the choice to do it, because the obligation doesn't necessarily make it the choice that I have. Somebody's going to ultimately hold me accountable to it, is kind of, Lisa, what you were talking about. But I view those as completely different. This one is given to me. This one is my obligation, and somebody's going to hold me to it. But this one is where I take the ownership. And if I do this, these two become non-issues. But I don't think enough of us look at it in that way. You can't force somebody to take ownership, can we?
No.
We can only force responsibility, and yes, we can enforce a certain amount of accountability, but we can't enforce ownership. So how do you create that?
Culture.
I think
be more specific, though.
It's pure. I believe in pure accountability. When we would interview people back at Unify, again, one of the questions I always ask, after you're here a year and you see one of your teammates not carrying their weight, how do you handle that? And if someone said, I put my head down, I just worry about myself, guess what? They were not a candidate any longer. I wanted people to hold people accountable because I wanted to be held accountable as well as the president. And I would tell my team all the time, please don't come to me a month, 2 months, complain about something when you know that I want you to hold accountable, because I'm not going to ask anyone to do anything that I would not be willing to do or haven't done before.
So you just bring up a good point. I want both of you to comment, or all of you to comment on this. You said the peer holds the person accountable. You just kind of brought that up. Whose job is it? Is it the boss's responsibility? Is it the peer?
Well, I communicated that I always wanted a culture of peer accountability. Again, we're in a small company, and we were very transparent with our numbers. And if someone wasn't carrying their weight, it didn't only affect the team members, it affected their families as well.
Sure.
So there was a ripple effect that I would always try and coach and teach to. Like, you have a decision to make every day when you wake up. Do your job, not do your job, as basic as it is. If you decide not to, you're not only affecting your behavior, but you're affecting everyone else in the company, as well as how about the external customer? There's a ripple effect that a lot of people don't understand by just sliding and gliding and not taking ownership or accountability.
What are your thoughts?
The best teams that I've seen function together, they've been part of a hiring process, right? So they definitely want that person on the team. Or they've built a relationship, you've given them the space, working on projects together in the office, you name it. And you can tell there is a genuine desire to ensure the other person is also successful. They enjoy working together. And so they naturally become accountable to each other without you even have to reinforce it or say it. Because it's like, Steve, I like working with you. I really want to work on this project. If I fail to get something done, I'm going to feel terrible that I let you down.
Yeah.
And that is hard to force. I think you can teach, you can encourage, you can train, but you find the people, it tends to have a rhythm about what's going to work in an organization when you've got the right people in,
What do you
from
think?
my perspective.
I think I agree with both of you. I think peer accountability is necessary, and for high performing teams, it's there and it's cultivated and developed based on working together, having success together, going through challenges together. But I would also say, I think we can't just stop there from like this, accountability across. There's accountability down, accountability across, but I think there's also accountability up.
What do you mean?
So from a cultural standpoint, and this has to be developed, I feel like my team, for example, I want them to hold me accountable for the things that I say, I own. I know that I could go to Jason, who's my boss, and say, hey, Jason, this is what was discussed. How can we work through this or whatever it is? But I think it has to be, it's a shared accountability throughout the whole organization, because it's an individual level, it's a team level, and it's a broader organizational level. And that's, your success on the team is my success of the team. The organization's success is my success. So it's a shared accountability.
Where does trust play in all this? Because that's one word we haven't discussed at all. Part of the accountability is the trust factor.
Can you separate the two? Trust and accountability. Can you do both? Or can you do accountability without trust? Truly, in the right way.
No.
I don't think you can. I think it's a lot tougher.
Yeah.
But I think it's easier to give people the space to do the job in the way and get the result that you want when you have a high level of trust. Right? It doesn't matter which route you took. If you got the end result, great. When you don't have a level of trust, that's where I see the breakdown is. There are a lot of questions because there's a fear they're not going to get to the end result. And then that becomes uncomfortable for both parties.
I'm seeing it in my head. It's almost accountability can drive trust and trust can drive accountability. So it can go both ways, I think.
Yeah, I don't know how you can have true accountability without some level, especially what you're talking about, that bottom up. You've got to trust your leader, and your leader's got to trust you to open the door to be able to do that, right? I mean, my conscience is sitting right across from us, right, looking at it.
I'm sure she holds you accountable.
Writing right now. But I think we have a fair enough level of trust and a relationship that it goes both ways. So I don't know that you can separate those two. To truly do accountability in the way that you guys are talking about, or we're talking about doing accountability, you can in the sense of how we generally use accountability. Here's your scorecard, you didn't do it, shame on you, and now you're in trouble. In order to do that, you don't need trust for.
No.
In fact, it breaks down trust by doing it that way. One of the comments I just got on text, though, was, it's not my job to hold my peer accountable, it's my boss's. As we're talking about this, it came through.
That's one person's choice. That's okay.
I think that's, again, it's your success or our success is my success in both ways. And when I think about the peer accountability, I just think about group projects in school. The dreaded group project where we're all on a group and inevitably someone's not doing this.
The slacker.
You have the slacker, and then you have someone who's like, oh no, like we have to get this done. So let me take it, and okay, I'll do this. Like I'm going to delegate. And I think when you're on a team, it can sometimes feel like that. But again, I think when there's trust and you have the right culture, you can have those conversations and you can say, Steve, your role in this is X, Y, Z. If this doesn't get done, here's the impact. What do we need to do to get this done?
Yeah.
Or find a role that Steve could be successful in. We did that all the time. We'd pivot someone. Okay, this isn't a good fit for them. Good person, good attitude, all the intangibles. Let's pivot and find them a position that they can be successful. That was always our mentality, because we hired them. We saw something in them that we liked. So let's find a place that they're going to be successful. And we did that numerous times in our organization.
But I would say on the peer accountability, it can't just be there. It does still need to come from the leader above.
There's an example there somewhere. I use this example since you brought up teams. When I played football when I was in 8th grade, 9th grade, and so on, I had to ride my bike to get to practice right after school, and in order to get there because my parents were working. And day one of football practice, I'm late. What do you think happens?
You ran.
By who told me to run? The coach.
The coach.
Day 2,
you all ran.
I ended up late again. We all ran. What happened on day 3? Because I did it 3 days in a row.
Your buddies were waiting there, make sure you're going to be on time.
The coach didn't have to say a word, and the coach realized at that point because he set the example of what was going to happen. It was the peers that said, "Okay, we did suicides, 100 yards. You know what that is, right? Like we're all puking at the end of this thing." So they didn't want to go through that again. So after that third time is when they finally said, "Okay, we have 2 options here. kick your butt off the team because we're not going to run again, or we're going to help you figure out how to actually do this. So he was smart enough to create this environment where there was his accountability to me, and it wasn't negative. It was teaching me a lesson, and then the team's accountability. But in the corporate world, is it that easy?
I think it depends, and I can't talk to whoever texted you, but I think I would ask if like
Well,
you solely as a
you can tell her. I actually know who she is.
Okay.
So you can tell her. She does not work here for the record.
Yeah, I think the question becomes like, are you a sole contributor, and like nothing you touch or do is impacted by your colleagues, and is that the same? I mean, maybe is that where your position's coming from, an accountability, or are you frustrated with your colleagues and don't know what to do and just want your boss to fix it?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's I'm not going to be the one to hold my colleagues accountable. Who knows?
They're going to follow the system, what's laid out in front of them. They're never going to make improvements to it. That's a level 1 functional employee team member, which you need. However, really, especially the world we live in today, to go to that next level with innovation, improvement, culture, things of that nature, we need level 3 employees, so team members. And they're your entrepreneurs, because they have that mindset of back to ownership.
Yes.
That's one of the characteristics of an entrepreneur, is ownership, resourceful, things of that nature.
But what I will surmise from that question is there probably is a lack of accountability within the organization by the mere fact of the way the question was stated.
It's so new. So she shared with this person, I got to be careful, shared with me yesterday that there is this sense of accountability, again, only happens when there's a negative outcome, right?
Yeah.
And then somebody comes in particular, her boss's boss, and that whole team comes in and, throws things and sets things, and it's a mid-sized company. Hopefully they're not throwing too many.
Did
big
you just
things.
say throw things inside
This
things?
happened yesterday.
Okay.
Like literally?
See,
Yesterday there was something that was picked up and thrown across the room. Did not add anybody.
Sounds like accountability is not the only issue.
in a fit of anger.
Whole nother topic.
And it's not the CEO, so there's an accountability issue for that kind of
Yes.
behavior. So we can unravel all kinds of things, but I do understand her concern that it seems to be a cultural thing.
Yeah.
So her question to me yesterday, and it's on the sheet too, but it's okay. We can talk all high level about what accountability is, the definition of it is, how we view it, how we've applied it. An organization that's struggling with it, which almost every company has pockets that are struggling with this whole idea of accountability. And if from your experiences, if you said, here's the practical things you need to do, not the high level, feel good, some of the conversation that we've had, but like if you were to go in an organization and try to change that in an organization, or if you have changed that in an organization, what would those steps be? What would you tell her?
Yeah. So I always start with, I said it when we started the conversation, clarity is key. Being clear is number 1. Put it in writing. So again, there's no misunderstanding. Conversation's always first, right? Put it in writing so it's very clear. And then check-ins to provide appropriate support with positive reinforcement. And then understanding the why behind it and the implications for not doing it, not just for the individual, for the team, the company, so people can get on board. And if they're not, because if you have that conversation, you can tell if someone's on board or not. I mean, it's not usually hard to read people's faces. Tell me why, what's the issue, to really peel that back and understand their perspective and start having that dialogue. I think you end up in a much better place.
I would just echo all of that. I think it's clarity, commitment, and consequence, but positive consequences.
Right.
So be clear, bring people with you, the why, how it's going to help them, the organization, how is it tied to the team goal, the organizational goal, what have you, and how can this best get done? Let's check in. If there's issues along the way, here's what you can do. But then I also think, and just kind of going back to the peer thing, it's coaching people and giving them guidance on this is how you can hold others accountable. This is how you can be accountable yourself. If this is the project, this is how you can hold your peers accountable. And this is the expectation. And then deliver the consequence, positive. Hey, this worked out well. You're meeting these objectives. I like how you were able to tell, Kathy to step it up here or whatever.
It happens all the time.
I'm sure it does.
So I do want to clarify, because I agree with you on the whole, we keep using the term positive consequence versus negative consequence.
And I know consequence is not the right word.
Well, actually, it is. You know what the definition of consequence
I
is?
mean, it's an action based on what you do.
Yeah, positive or negative.
Positive or negative, exactly.
We just happen to usually use it as, oh crap, there's a consequence, so we've got a problem. So answer your thoughts on that, the advice that you would give, the steps, anything different from what Kathy or Felicia
I think they're both spot on. I mean, it's just fostering a team. We focused about team, almost to the detriment, where it was just team. And as long as the culture's like that and everyone understands their role within the organization, that's where you can have the peer accountability. Example of that, sometimes we get extreme operations would go to the sales leader and say, hey, your team's not doing their job. Well, let's have a conversation around that versus just, and again, people lie, numbers don't. And as long as you have the data to support accountability to a certain degree, it kind of works its way out.
So let's hit on it, because you mentioned clarity, metrics, scorecard. We've talked about all this. I pulled this yesterday in Forbes. 80% of employees feel that their performance metrics are out of their control. Think about, first step is clarity. Okay, we're giving all these scorecards, metrics, and so forth. But according to this study that they did, and I don't know how many people, there's like 11,000 people that responded, 80% of employees feel that their performance metrics are out of their control.
I would love to what size companies they work within.
know.
I know.
I can pull the study.
Because I think there's a lot of data behind that where typically, and I've been in that spot before where you feel that you can't, whatever, and again, I was in sales, so it's easy to quantify the numbers, but I remember sitting in meetings 10, 15 years ago where the CEO had said, you need to get to $250 million in 5 years, let me know how you're going to do it, and walk out of the room. And you're starting at zero. That's the worst feeling in the world. However, if you're in an environment, from my perspective, and if those people felt that they couldn't obtain their numbers, I would ask that person, if they were on my team, well, justify, how can we get you there? How can we get you there? I had a gentleman, I gave a $10 million, he's probably watching, a $10 million goal to, he started crying. And I said, whoa, stop. I will not let you fail, period, at all. You will be successful, and I'll make sure I get you there. This year, he'll do probably 30 million. That year, he did 12 million. People, trust. You have to have trust back and forth.
Here's a comment we just got. What I've seen is accountability by scorecard. If you haven't done what I've asked you to do in the time I need you to do it, you're useless to me.
That's a harsh comment.
It's anonymous. It's truly anonymous. I have no idea who did this one. I mean, I just wonder if that's a very pervasive feeling.
I mean, honestly, go back to what you just read, the statistic. Honestly, my first reaction to was, how sad. 80% of the people that responded, irrespective of the size company or the number of people, feel like how they're being rated is completely out of their control. It's just sad.
Terrible feeling.
Right?
You're set up to fail.
You're like, okay, so then my head goes to, what's their level of engagement?
That's
are
exactly.
they happy with the company they work for? Like, I just
But they control that. They control that. If you're not happy and you don't feel engaged in your organization, now it's becoming tougher. But over the last couple of years, you had your pick of a company you would want to go to.
Well, I will say this: successful people control it.
Bingo.
I think therein lies the question, and there are people that feel stuck in their jobs for whatever reason, personal situation, level of education. I mean, who knows? But it's sad that that's where we're at.
So go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it goes back to that culture piece too, on what you're rewarding. So if you're rewarding, the people who drive, and the comment that just came in, that if the people who are doing those things, leaders, are being rewarded because they're getting numbers, and if they're not, they're bringing in new people who they're driving hard, then it does become pervasive. And so I think in addition to accountability, it's broader than how the organization, what the organization celebrates and rewards from a leadership standpoint, and not just people leaders, but individual leadership as well.
Sure. So there was another question that kind of goes alongside of this. It's hard to talk about accountability, and this is to your comment just a second ago, RJ. It's hard to talk about accountability when employees these days take that as an attack and leave. How do you suggest we address this? It's almost like hurting feelings.
And that's a lot of times why people don't have these tough conversations, because we think we can either be empathetic and not accountable, or if I'm accountable, it has to be mean.
Right.
and it doesn't.
So if this 80% number is true, that it's the clarity issue, how do you start? How do you address that particular issue? Because if that's the first thing you said, you got to have clarity. We've all kind of said it to a certain extent. In accountability, the first thing is being clear. But by this number, let's just assume for right now that it's the right number. 80% of people think that they can't control what's on their scorecard. What do we do? What advice are we going to give people? What advice are you going to give people?
That's a great question. I will just tell you, we are in the midst of changing the way our scorecard works. I just had to have this conversation with the team.
Okay.
And we're probably behind in changing how the scorecard is done. We've gone from a 5-point system to 4 very clear definitions, which in my mind, again, I'm okay. I like change. I'm actually the one who pushes change. I'm comfortable trying new things. But I recognize on the change spectrum, right, which there's many books from psychologists, you've probably, given your degree, right, like where people are at and how they feel about it. You have to keep talking about it and explaining it and address their concern. And it's like exceeded expectations, met your expectations, partially met, partially achieved, or did not achieve. And then there's some really clear definitions below it. And what I said to the team in having the conversation was, look, we used to rate from 1 to a 5, telling someone they partially achieved a goal. And that's literally, the scorecard is there. You have all the capabilities and skill sets. There was some barrier in your way, economic conditions, customer related issues that drove these outcomes, even though you went through and did every single thing you should have done. That's a partially achieved. Doesn't that feel better than saying you were a 2? Right? That's a whole different conversation.
The same thing.
Right? Yeah. You're going through the same thing. Like everyone's going through it. So again, accountability is a topic, changing the way you have these conversations. But the hope is, from my perspective, better clarity and feeling better about the conversation of, you have the skill set, for whatever reason you just didn't quite achieve this year, but here, and you can focus more on what you're going to learn and how we develop you as an employee moving forward, versus the way we used to have these crazy conversations. You rated yourself a 3. I think you're a 2. You rated yourself a 4. I think you're also a 4. Like through every box, it was kind of a crazy process. So what's the solution here? Well, if you're a people leader, I think you go talk to your leadership team about, I sense we're having a challenge. What are we thinking we're going to do within the organization? If you're an employee, hopefully you feel comfortable about having a conversation with your people leader and your people leaders, like manager and the other leadership team, that you have enough ability to have those conversations to at least raise the issue. Because I think you have to acknowledge there is an issue before you can get everybody on board with changing it.
Sure.
And if they're not willing to do that, I think you go back to you gotta deal with it, right? You gotta try and help change it, or you gotta decide you want to leave it. And I'm not one for like, okay, it's time to all go change roles, but those are things people have to make a decision on. Because God, working in a world where you feel like 8 out of like 10 people are just have no control and are probably
walking zombies.
Like,
Right.
That's not great.
No.
That's not great.
So what are your comments on this, RJ and Louisa? If that's, let's make the assumption it's true.
80%, that's tough.
Oh, yeah.
I think if that's the case, there's a broader, maybe organizational systemic issue. If there's these robust, I'll make an assumption, there's robust goals from a company standpoint, and we're telling everyone, down all the levels that you're accountable to this, that's not practical.
Yeah.
And so I think as a leader, if I felt like that was happening, for myself or my organization, I think, to Kathy's point, there's a duty to raise up to higher leadership and say, hey, here, help me understand the why, firstly, so it's clear for me, so then I can communicate. But then I think it also needs to come from up. We need to be able to say, hey, I can't deliver $5 million next year when last year, I delivered $500,000, and here's my resources, and this was the plan. Like, help me to do this. And If that's the expectation, then we need to ensure people have the right tools, resources, time, et cetera, to do the work. And it sounds like 80% of people don't feel that way.
And that goes back to trust too, to be that you feel you feel trust in your organization that you can go have that conversation. I have a completely different point. I think we've created an environment, a world of victims and a victim mentality, and they rather take the victim mentality because they view it's easier versus owning it. Hence why people say it's easy to say I can't achieve this because it's irrational versus saying, you know what, let's figure out a way how to get there.
Yeah, the other question or the other comment was, I might upset somebody. That was actually the background of that particular. I know who sent that one in too.
Mm-hmm.
That was the background.
Was it his career? No.
We're tired. I mean, I am so quick. So and my eyes are always open to find good candidates for our organization. It would drive my family nuts. I'd check into a hotel if the person behind the desk gave me great service. Hey, what do you want to do in your life? I'd hand a business card. This particular gentleman I met at a cigar bar. He was at the time 26 years old. My wife looked at me, she goes, "You're going to hire him." I said, "If he does everything he's supposed to do during this process, yeah, I'm going to hire him." Hired him, came in as a account manager. Now he's in sales. Met his wife, who's a credit analyst, married for 5 years now. That's what motivates me when those things happen.
And it could have just been the day, right? Like you may have just said that it was just the day for this poor guy.
No, and it wasn't. It wasn't bawling or anything like that. I could just sense it, and I said, you will be successful. I'm not. Believe me, you just have to have faith. It's sort of like when you're running a mile, okay, I'm at 8 minutes or 10 minutes or 12 minutes. So you're trying to get a quicker to get down to 10 minutes. Maybe you just train. It's the same thing with accountability and your job responsibilities, I believe.
There was just bringing it up. I took one of my team members to lunch at a restaurant right up here on Plymouth Road a couple months ago, and this is a place that's never busy when you walk in. Like, so you can just walk in, sit down, get out. Really, that's why I go there every once in a while. We pull into the parking lot and there's hundreds of cars. I'm like, oh, this sucks. We get inside and we wait at the host stand. I mean, it had to have been 11, 12 minutes. It was like, that feeling, and you're like, this is not going to go well. Mm-hmm. We finally get set. There's only 2 waiter and a waitress in the entire building, and there's quite a few people in there. It sets us down in another 10 minutes before he comes back over. Now, at that point, I want to hold him accountable. Like, what would you do in that particular situation?
I might decide if we should just go.
Should we leave? That's one option. What else would you do?
I would personally say, man, I see you're busy here. You're doing a great job. Try and pump them up a little bit, because especially service workers where we live in today now, if you're not thanking them, smiling at them, trying to help them, then that's a human being type.
You're a bigger man than me, RJ.
Well,
what would you do?
Maybe that's today.
Well, before he sat down, I probably would have said, so what is going on in this place today?
So my natural instinct would be to hold him accountable by finding the manager and giving the manager. That's my natural instinct. It's probably a lot of ours to a certain extent. But I decided to take a different route because I had somebody with me, which was
setting an example.
Holding you accountable.
So if I was by myself, I probably would have not reacted in the appropriate way. But because I had somebody, when I asked the waiter to come over, finally he comes over, and I gave him a $50 bill, and I said, "Can I get change for this? Because I want to make sure I leave you a really good tip." And he kind of looks at me, walks away, and a few seconds later, he's back with 20, 20, and 10, knowing he's going to get either 10 or 20 bucks out of this thing or something along those lines. And all of a sudden, the service changes. So much so that the 2 tables on either side of us come over and like, "What did you say to him?" Because our service has completely changed. Thought nothing of it. I just thought, you know what, I'm going to give a good example to the person that I'm with. We walk out into the parking lot, and out of the back door, this waiter comes running around, gives me a hug. Don't know this kid, aside from this interaction, and he's bawling on my shoulder. What is going on? He says, "You don't understand. My mom died yesterday, and the only reason I'm here is because they would have been left with 1 server, and they would have had to shut the doors." Had no idea, but my natural accountability hat would have been, I'm going to give, oh man, I'm pissed off at this kid. But somebody was there to hold me accountable. It wasn't Leo, but somebody was there to hold me accountable to act in a different way. So it does change how we approach. We don't know, to your point, of what's happening in that given day. But so we've got a couple of minutes left, and kind of your closing thoughts on this. This is not, we're not going to solve the problem today. First of all, we're not going to do that, especially if 80% of people think the beginning stages of accountability are messed up. And I have to believe some of that's true, even if it's not truly 80%, right? So that's a problem. What would be the closing advice you would give to, one, the leader that's watching, two, the employee, and I hate to even use that term, but the team member that's saying, we don't get it around here. What's the quick sentence for each of those that you would give, Kathy?
Yeah. So for the leader, I would say walk through the steps we outlined, right? Be really clear, make sure you've got clear, concise roles, follow through, control what you can control. Even if there's a broader cultural issue, what you control, the people that report to you. And if you're a colleague, I would say take the step to meet with your people leader and say, look, I want to be really clear. If you feel like there's a lack of clarity about what the expectations are, about what I'm doing well, about where you feel I can improve, and how can we build out a plan together. I think if you can be brave enough to do that, it will completely change the dynamic with your people leader, especially if they're afraid or fearful to have the conversations, because you've been vulnerable enough to say, I want the feedback. Please give it to me. You've given them permission to do that. And can we engage in a dialogue and a relationship like that?
Wonderful. Lisa.
All of that, and as a leader, I think it's when you're setting the expectations and you're communicating clarity, bring your team members or your team along the way with you. So instead of, this is what you're going to do, this is the end state, this is what we want, how can we get there? What are your ideas? What barriers do you see? So let them be part of the build, the how that we get there, and then communicate along the way, reinforcement, find what motivates people, find people's why, and include that. And I think then as a team member, for your own leader, exactly what Kathy said, feel empowered to have that conversation with your leader and ask the questions and get the information that you need so it's clear for you to be able to deliver on what you need to deliver on and feel good about what you're doing.
What you just said is what Mr. Pete, if I go back to my example earlier, did for me, because when he walked me around his yard, he showed me exactly how to do everything his wife had done prior to her death. Right, so it was showing exactly the how and getting my input. Can you do this? How would you do this? And so forth. Thank you, Lisa.
That's a whole nother level of guilt as well, because now you feel in your heart you've let her down as well.
Well, so his intention, though, I do not believe was guilt.
Okay.
His intention was to actually help me grow.
To show you.
He's since passed, but he wasn't the kind of guy that was gonna. And that's I think that was a trust thing to a certain extent. We lived next to the guy at that age, I was 14, so I knew him for 14 years in one form or another. Trust is definitely a big issue. RJ,
I would echo what has already been said. And from a leader, don't start questioning your drive to have people reach their full potential. And again, that goes back to the person and not the leader. But stay true to who you are as a leader, and have those conversations if they feel you're being irrational or can't hit numbers or things of that nature or do their responsibilities. And what you said, clarity's spot on. If you're the team member, the employee, you own your career. You own what you do on a daily basis. Do not play the victim card, and figure out a way that you can be successful in that current organization would be the first choice. And if not, find an organization that you believe in from a mission, vision, and idea perspective that you feel you can fit into that team. Go seek that leader and tell them that that's what you're looking for. However, you have to deliver after that. So I think it's been a great conversation, and we're not going to solve it in an hour.
I am going to add one thing onto that. There's this saying that, relationships are 50-50. And then there's another saying that says, no, they're not. They're 100-100, because they're 100% from one person, because when the other person can't give 100%, that one person is, and vice versa. I think this relationship, this whole accountability relationship in the workplace is 100% the responsibility of the employee and 100% the responsibility of the leader of that particular employee. I don't think it's a 50-50 game.
Yeah.
So thank you, all three of you, for
Thank
sharing
you.
your thoughts on this. We're not going to solve the problem today. In fact, my guess is over the next couple of weeks, we're going to get a lot more questions, comments, and thoughts now that things are percolating. So I may ask you to come back on if you're open to doing that at some point in the future. For all of you that are watching, if you want to be part of a Leadership Live in the future, and you've got some content, you've got some thoughts around something related to leadership, business results, all these things, employees, please let us know. Reach out to Leah. She's all over the internet, so you know who I'm talking about in particular. Reach out to me directly. You can text me again at 734-837-8500. We're talking about going to monthly as opposed to quarterly. We don't know if we're going to do that yet, but stay tuned for some announcements around Leadership Live and some other cool things that we're going to be doing into the new year. So again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to all of you that are watching. do not hesitate to reach out. If you want to get in contact with these folks, I can make sure that that happens as well. So again, thank you, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
That's awesome.
Thanks, guys.